Good evening. On behalf of the Indiana University College of Arts and Sciences, I would like to thank you for joining us on IU Day. I'm Vanessa Clow, and I serve as the college's Director of Alumni Relations. Our Food for Thought live streaming series serves as an opportunity for alumni and friends to hear from faculty experts, explore topics of interest, and stay connected with IU and the College of Arts and Sciences, regardless of your location. I'm delighted to introduce tonight's featured presenter, Associate Professor and IU alumna, Natalie Hipple from the IU Department of Criminal Justice. Professor Hipple is an expert on gun violence, problem-solving policing, incident reviews, restorative justice, and evaluation of criminal justice programs. For the last 20 years, she has worked extensively with a variety of law enforcement agencies in Indiana, the Midwest, and across the United States to identify and reduce crime and disorder, especially as they relate to gun violence. Following her presentation, Professor Hipple will be joined by University of Missouri St. Louis Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice, Beth Huebner, for the audience Q&A session. Dr. Huebner's research interests include the collateral consequences of incarceration, racial and gender disparities in the criminal justice system, and public policy. You can submit your questions at any point during this evening's discussion. Simply click on the Q&A tab located in your webinar toolbar. Hover your mouse over the screen and your toolbar should appear. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Hipple for her presentation. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you very much for joining me this evening. I wanted to thank you for joining me on IU Day. I'm a double IU graduate and now so lucky to be working in the Department of Criminal Justice, from where I earned 2 degrees. I live with an IU graduate of this department as well. He may or may not have carried one of the infamous Showalter fish for a little while in 1987. And my stepdaughter is a 2020 pandemic graduate. We're proud Hoosiers. And I'm really grateful to be here. It's my privilege to talk to you about some of my work around gun violence. I'm a policing scholar with a specific interest in police problem solving. That is how law enforcement agencies work to solve issues they're faced with, such as gun violence. Gun violence is an especially timely issue, especially in Indianapolis, Indiana. I want to thank the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department. They're a top-notch agency, and without their partnership, the work I do would not be possible. I also want to thank my friend and colleague, Dr. Beth Huebner, who's moderating today's discussion. I'm really lucky to have her as a friend as well. I'm going to start today by talking about crime measurement, specifically about how gun violence is measured, or how I believe it should be measured. I'll then talk about gun violence in Indianapolis, and finally, I'll finish with some recent work on gun-involved youth. Then we can open it up for discussion and questions. I want to begin with just a quick lesson on crime data. When you hear about crime rates, you're most likely hearing about figures that come from the Uniform Crime Report, or UCR. More specifically, you're probably hearing about what are called Part 1 crimes. Part 1 violent crimes include homicide, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. Part 1 property crimes include burglary, larceny, and vehicle theft. Local law enforcement agencies report these data to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who then compile them and publish the data each year. Crimes are reported to the FBI using standard definitions, which make rates comparable across cities in the United States, even though local laws may differ. The UCR was created in the 1930s, and as you can imagine, needed some updates given the changing world. One of the drawbacks to the UCR is that it only allows for 1 crime incident per event. So if someone is robbed and robbed of their money and their car is stolen, this event is labeled as a robbery in the UCR, and the stolen car is never captured. This fact makes it so crime rates are really an undercount of what's going on in your jurisdiction. The National Incident-Based Reporting System, or NIBRS, was created as a replacement for the UCR. The FBI sunsetted the UCR in 2021, asking all law enforcement agencies to start reporting to NIBRS. NIBRS addresses some of the shortcomings of the UCR. For example, it allows up to 10 crime types per event. So using the previous example, someone who's robbed of their money and their car is stolen, in NIBRS, both crimes would be counted that occurred during that single event, which in turn creates a more accurate report of what's happening as far as crime goes. The issue right now is that law enforcement agencies have been slow to adopt NIBRs. So we're sort of in limbo as far as crime statistics go, but that's a story for another day. That's not what I'm here to talk to you about. Gun violence can encompass a lot of things. It's a broad umbrella that spans several disciplines. It has been declared a public health crisis. Today, we're going to talk about criminal gun violence, which can be anything from firing a gun at someone and missing all the way to the death of someone from gunfire. Here I present a taxonomy of gun violence. At one end on the left is the instance where a gun has been fired and no one's been hit. That's still an aggravated assault. On the other end, on the right side, is the incident where someone has been hit by gunfire and dies, or a homicide. In the middle is a non-fatal shooting. Someone's hit by gunfire but does not die. We know much more about shootings at the right end of the taxonomy than we do about shootings at the left end. This fact is interesting because homicides are statistically rare events. So we know much more about the rare events than we do about the most common events. That is, we collect and have access to very reliable and accurate data around homicides, but the same is not the case as you move farther left on the taxonomy. It's really important to look at criminal gun violence holistically, though, both fatals and non-fatals. However, neither the UCR nor the NIBRs, these are our two main official sources of data used in the field by law enforcement and researchers alike, neither one of those include a definition for the middle category, a non-fatal shooting. There's no national definition for a non-fatal shooting and no official source for these data. And many cities do not or are unable to collect these data. These issues make it so we cannot compare across jurisdictions like we can with homicides. It also prevents us from having a holistic look at gun violence. It's not just deaths by gunfire that we should be looking at. The police, the community, and policymakers are left with an incomplete picture of gun violence if they rely on just the official statistics. A core part of my work over the last just about decade has been focused on making it so we can look at criminal gun violence more holistically. Research shows that more people are surviving gunshot wounds. Survival is increasing because of advances in medicine, for sure, but also advances in the field. Law enforcement officers and others are being equipped with things like tourniquet kits so they can administer aid right on the scene and help EMS get those folks to hospitals to help save lives. But as I've mentioned, the data around shootings are unreliable and make comparisons impossible. So I spent a lot of time thinking about how to define and measure non-fatal shootings in order to help law enforcement officials and others. You cannot create effective policy if you can't measure the thing that you're trying to change. So I set out to create a workable definition for law enforcement agencies to use. Then they had to figure out how to count the incidents that met that definition. I've worked with the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department for most of my career, and I credit their willingness to work with me and their desire to examine both fatal and non-fatal shootings carefully. Criminal homicides are easy to count and collect data around. Most cities in the United States are doing that really well, and there are official sources that capture the information about homicides, like the UCR and NIBRs. IMPD took this challenge very seriously and have been able to report accurate non-fatal shooting statistics since about 2016. What follows is my suggested definition of a non-fatal shooting. As I said, you can't measure what you can't count, and that all starts with a good definition. This work actually started when I asked IMPD, many years ago, if they knew how many people were being shot each year, and they were unsure that they could generate an accurate number of all shootings beyond fatal shootings. So this is what I'm suggesting, and this is the definition that I used for my work and that other cities have adopted and IMPD specifically has adopted. First of all, criminal shootings need to meet the definition of an aggravated assault. The definition in both the UCR and the NIBRs data sources is the same. An aggravated assault is an unlawful attack by one person upon another person for the purpose of inflicting severe or aggravated bodily injury. If the incident meets the UCR NIBR's definition of an aggravated assault, then it also must include a physical injury from a gunshot wound. The final definition that we use followed federal code when we went to define what a firearm is. We use that to guide the definition because weapons that meet this definition are crime drivers and are most commonly subjected to regulation at the state and national level and also subject to much national debate. So to be a firearm, the weapon must have a powder discharge. So the definition therefore excludes, and again, I'm talking about a criminal non-fatal shooting, definition excludes shootings that are done in self-defense or are self-inflicted regardless of intent, or accidental. For example, you shoot someone while you're cleaning your gun accidentally. BB guns and air rifles and flare guns also don't meet the definition of a firearm because there's no powder discharge. Therefore, incidents with those types of weapons are excluded from the definition as well. So now that I've got the measurement issues out of the way, that's where I wanted to start. I wanted to talk to you about the first of two projects I'm going to talk about today. This one's we called it the Tale of Four Cities. And so from a Mr. Obvious point of view, we looked at gun violence across 4 Midwestern cities: Indianapolis, Detroit, Milwaukee, and St. Louis. There was a local researcher in each of the project cities, and the moderator, Beth Huebner, was the researcher in St. Louis, which is one of the reasons I invited her to help me out today. I will focus on Indianapolis for this presentation. I'd also just like to thank the National Institute of Justice, which is the research arm of the Department of Justice, for their financial funding for this work. So if you look at the Midwest, these figures here, these are the 4 states where the 4 cities for our project came from. This is violent crime. So if you remember me talking about part 1 crimes, this is homicide, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. These are the rates per 100,000 population. And if you look at the Midwest, you can see that all of us, all 4 states that we were looking at, have violent crime rates that are considerably higher than the national crime rate. This was part of a trend in the Midwest, where the Midwest was experiencing increases in violent crime while the rest of the country was either experiencing decreases or remaining flat. Again, the Midwest was showing a rate, and these rates come from 2020. So these are not too old. And I'm going to talk specifically about Indianapolis. I realize most of you are familiar with Indiana or with IU in Bloomington, but if you're not familiar with Indianapolis, located in Marion County, is 361 square miles. It has a population of about 880,000, which it has grown slightly. The 2020 census indicates that the population has grown just a little bit more. It's 62% white and 10% Hispanic or Latinx. The Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department is staffed with 1,590 sworn officers at full capacity. They're significantly below capacity, but at full capacity there's 19 police officers per 10,000 residents. And in 2020, there were 24 homicides per 100,000. And that rose significantly from 18 per 100,000 in 2018. And the national average around that time was 6 per 100,000. So not the most violent city in the nation, but nothing to ignore there. There's plenty of violence going on that needs to be addressed. So here's a bar chart of criminal shooting victims in Indianapolis over the last 4 years to give you an idea of what's going on. The blue is non-fatal shooting victims, and the red parts of the bar are fatal victims. Criminal shootings, that is fatal and non-fatal incidents that meet the definition discussed here, have significantly increased in the prior 2 years, and you can see that here from the chart. This green line that I'm adding is the actual number of incidents. So the bars themselves are victims, and the green line is the number of incidents. And if you notice, the green line has started to pull away from the top of the bar, which means that we're having an increase in multiple victim incidents. So incidents where more than one person is shot. I'm not talking about mass shootings. That's a whole nother talk that someone else can give. That's not my area of expertise, but we're having incidents where more than one person is shot at a time. So if you do the math, that's 1.97 people shot every day in the city of Indianapolis. Some survive and some don't. This is based on those statistics from 2018 to 2021. And that's about 1.93. So again, almost 2 criminal shooting incidents every day, but we are having more incidents where multiple people are shot. So one of the major project tasks was to get a handle on how many non-fatal shootings were occurring across those 4 sites. But we were literally interested in counting them just to see what they looked like, because it was not something that we could easily do. And that was one of the things that the National Institute of Justice was interested in. But we were also interested in looking at how things look geographically or spatially. Here, fatal and non-fatal shooting incidents are layered on top of concentrated disadvantage. Fatal shootings are shown as the black points, non-fatal shootings are shown as the white points, and the block group disadvantage is represented by the black and gray color scale. So the darker the values indicates higher concentrated disadvantage. And we created this measure using census data, looking at things like percent unemployed, percent living in poverty, percent without health care, percent receiving food stamps, and percent of female-headed households. We saw the same patterns here. So if you look, you can see that the shootings tend to occur in areas of higher concentrated disadvantage. And that red star is the circle, if you're familiar with Indianapolis. It's the city, the geographic city center where the monument is. We saw these same patterns across all 4 cities in our project, or the other 3 cities, including Indianapolis. These data, as you can see, are a little bit old. It took a long time for us to get the data collected and analyzed, but we don't see, even looking now, we don't see that the patterns have changed much, that these patterns tend to hold, just an increased volume in shootings given the last couple of years. We were also interested in the motive for the shooting. So why did the shooting occur? What was going on that led to this act of violence? We collected these data from the detectives who were investigating the cases or from reading actual case reports, and we tried to determine the motive for the shooting. We found 3 common reasons for people to shoot each other, and either fatally or non-fatally: interpersonal conflict, drugs, and robbery. And I want to be clear here that robbery is when someone forcibly takes something from another person using a threat of violence. Lots of people, especially in the media, can intermingle robbery and burglary. And when you're talking about robbery, you're actually talking about a violent crime. A burglary is actually not a violent crime, it's a property crime. There's no violence involved. So these were our 4 categories, 3 categories: interpersonal, dispute, drugs, and robbery. And then we have this unknown category. The top percentages are the percent motives for fatal shootings, and the bottom percentages are for non-fatal shootings. For both shooting types, when the motive was known, the majority of incidents were fueled by interpersonal conflicts. And this has held true for a long time, especially with homicides, but we just didn't have the information to back that up with non-fatal shootings. For homicides, for when someone is killed, the second most common reason for fatal shootings is drug-related. The crime was drug-related. But not so for non-fatal shootings. The second most common motive was robbery. And then what's interesting here is if you look at this category on the far right, which is the unknown motive, we only have about 12% of the fatal shootings where the motive is unknown. And the victim here is deceased. And so they're able to determine the motive from other things, from witnesses, from camera, from evidence, from other things. The detectives are able to come up with a motive. But 50% of the cases that we looked at in Indianapolis, the motive for the non-fatal shooting was unknown. This is really interesting when you think about the fact that the victim has survived. And so the most important witness to your case is unwilling to work with the police and unwilling to tell them about their case. And so this is something we have to think about when we're talking about problem-solving policing and how to build policy and training and issues related to this. It's really hard for detectives to solve your case if you're unwilling to participate in the case. And so that was sort of one of the bigger policy implications that we'll talk about a little bit at the end. And then who are the victims? We did some work around this, but I think all of us would admit, all of the researchers would admit that we'd really like to talk to the victims themselves, the ones that survived, to get some more information. But that being said, the most common criminal shooting victim in Indianapolis is a person of color. And in Indianapolis, that means a Black person. But a quarter of the victims in Indianapolis were white. This finding bucked the trend from the other Midwest cities. Indianapolis had the highest percentage of white non-fatal shooting victims when you looked at the three other cities. The average age is 28. And interestingly, non-fatal shooting victims tend to be younger than fatal victims. We've also been seeing an increase in the number of female victims. Almost 20% are female in Indianapolis, which again is a really high number when you compare it to the other 3 cities that we were looking in: Milwaukee, St. Louis, and Detroit. Fatal shootings tend to have a higher percentage of female victims. And so this could be a reflection of the domestic motive, which I didn't talk about. Typically, when the motive is domestic related, unfortunately, the end result tends to be a fatality. And so that could be that Indianapolis could have a higher domestic violence rate and therefore more female victims. Now that I've talked a little bit about shooting incidents and victims in particular, I want to switch gears just a little bit and talk about another project of interest and one that I'm currently working on right now. It's about youth and guns. These data come from a project that examines youth that were court-ordered into a program called Project Life. That means they were adjudicated in court, and as part of their sentence, the judge ordered them to attend a program called Project Life. The mission of Project Life is to educate youth and their families about the consequences of illegal gun use and acts of violence. For this project, I'd like to really thank the Joyce Foundation. They're particularly generous in their funding, and I'm really grateful that they were able to help us get these data and talk more about youth and guns. Project Life is delivered through a partnership between the Marion County Prosecutor's Office, Eskenazi Health, IU Health, the Marion County Health Department, and Connections, Inc. It also involves the injury prevention coordinators from the 3 level 1 trauma centers, plus Riley Children's Hospital, all located in Indianapolis. I also want to thank the Marion County Superior Court. Just as IMPD was so important to my work on non-fatal shootings, I wouldn't be able to do this work without the support of the Superior Court, which allowed me to look at juvenile court data. So this project, I basically had 2 research questions that I started with. One is, who are gun-involved youth? Who are the youth that are involved with guns in Indianapolis? There really isn't a lot of information and research out there, a lot of empirical work on who gun-involved youth are. There's a stereotype that it's all young Black males, but there's really no data to support that. It's just really hard to come by and really labor intensive to collect these kind of data. And so the empirical work is really, really scant. The other thing we were setting out to do is look at a recidivism analysis and outcome analysis for this program. Does sending youth to Project Life help reduce recidivism? So the goal is to keep them out of the system. You saw the 4 goals, or they're coming up actually on the next slide. The goal is to keep them out of the system, the criminal justice system itself, but we also have some very specific goals that Project Life was trying to accomplish. First is to prevent recidivism, to improve community safety, prevent injury or death related to violence, present community resources to promote safety and resilience, and create positive contact with law enforcement. Project Life is a 9-hour curriculum that's delivered over 3 days. It did have some changes in it due to COVID, but it is back to a 3-day in-person programming. So my study cohort were youth that were court-ordered into Project Life from January 1st of 2015 through December 31st of 2019. Again, this is a court-ordered program, meaning it's post-conviction. It's not a diversion program. And so the final study cohort was 440 unique youths. And so again, I'm looking at this first research question now. Who are the gun-involved youth? As far as gender goes, they are mostly males. For our cohort, all but 16 of these 440 were males. The youth's ages for qualifying offenses ranged from 11 to 18 years old. They had a mean age of 15.8 years. 1/3 of the kids here, if you look, what's interesting here is 1/3 of the kids were 16 or 17 years, I'm sorry, 1/3 were 17 years or older, with 60% being 16, 17, or 18. That puts them in the driving range. And so that's one of the things we're looking at with this project. These are initial findings that I'm presenting to you. That's coming out later is how these folks came into contact with the police. And a lot of them are coming into contact with the police as part of being in a car or driving. So that would be reflected here in the age ranges. 89% of the kids were kids of color, which meant they were mostly Black. We had some Asian youth, as well as kids that have identified as multiracial. We also had, what was really unique about these data were that we could get ethnicity separate from race. Oftentimes it's lumped together, which there's a whole argument on that as well, but for our purposes, we were interested in separating out race and ethnicity. 8% of the kids that were court-ordered to Project Life were Hispanic or Latinx, which the latest census revealed that Indianapolis is about 10%. So that was more on par with the population of the city. So what got these kids into the program? Again, we're trying to describe these kids. And so who are these gun-involved youth and what brought them into the program? So the first thing I want to make clear here is that we were looking at charges that were filed by the prosecutor. When a police officer makes an arrest, they have to put charges on the arrest slip that are then forwarded to the prosecutor. And then the prosecutor makes the decision on whether to actually stick with those charges or change the charges or drop the charges. So the police role is done once the arrest is made, and the actual charges that are filed, that decision is made by the prosecutor. So we were looking at charges that were actually filed. For most of these kids, there were often multiple charges in their incident that brought them into Project Life. So their qualifying incident, their gun-involved incident that brought them into Project Life. So we selected, if they had a gun charge, because again, they could have had a gun charge that was dropped by the prosecutor, and we didn't know that. And so if they had a gun charge, we selected that charge as their primary charge. Otherwise, we looked at their most serious charge. And even doing this still gave us 30 categories of charges. And so we really tried to simplify this to get a good grip on what was going on with these kids. The other thing that sort of complicated things is in the middle of our study period, Indiana changed from a 4-level misdemeanor felony system where they were labeled A felony, B felony, C felony, to a 6-level numbered 1 through 6. And so there was some, things didn't always match up well between the two. And so we just decided to simplify it in the way that I'm going to show you here in just a second. So we basically looked at whether or not we read every case report, whether or not a gun was recovered at the scene of their incident, and whether or not they had a violent charge. And when I talk about a violent charge, I'm going back to those same Part 1 violent crimes: murder, rape, robbery, assault, strangulation, and we included strangulation as well. It's a separate charge in Indiana. It's not that way in every state, but it is in Indiana. And so we created 4 different categories. The lowest, sort of, if you were to put them on the pyramid, the lowest one was that there was no gun at the scene and a nonviolent charge. And then a gun, no gun at the scene and a violent charge. And then we took the cases where there were guns and put them at the top of the pyramid because of the potential for violence there. A gun was found at the scene and there was a nonviolent charge, and a gun was found at the scene and there was a violent charge. So this is the bulk of the kids that came into the program. Almost 70% had a gun at the scene, but were charged with a nonviolent offense. And that could be something like possession of a weapon. Kids under the age of 18 are not allowed to have guns, period. There's no exceptions to that, except during transfer, during hunting and things like that. But if you're in the city of Indianapolis, you probably shouldn't have a gun if you're under the age of 18. So it seems that most of that we were targeting the right audience here. 70% had a gun with a nonviolent charge. What's interesting here is this 17% where there's no gun and no violent charge. What we think is happening here is that either there was a gun charge and the prosecutor decided not to file it, or there was a violent charge and they decided to go for a lesser charge. So this is sort of the second group here: no gun, no violent. But this is something that we want to talk to the judges about and get a little more clarification about why these kids are coming to the program. And then Project Life just wasn't geared towards gun-involved youth. If you looked at the mission statement, it was an education about violence as well. They were targeting kids that were involved in violence. So this would make sense that they had no gun and a violent charge. And then this is a really small percentage that had both a gun and a violent charge. And one of the reasons for that is this: in order to go to Project Life, you had to be able to be put on probation and remain in the community. And so if you were arrested for homicide, you probably weren't deemed safe enough to leave in the community. Before we look at recidivism, which is whether or not the program kept them from coming back in the system, we wanted to look at program completion. And so how many of these kids got the full dose of Project Life? The overall completion rates for Project Life were 83.4%, but did vary by demographic characteristics. White kids completed at higher rates than the other races. Latinx kids completed at higher rates than non-Latinx kids. All 16 of our females completed the program, so they completed at higher rates than the males, even though there were so few of them. And then interestingly here, citizenship, kids that were not US citizens completed at higher rates than US citizens. We also looked at characteristics of their home life. It didn't seem to really matter if the mother was at home as to a difference in completion rates. They completed about equally, but this is an interesting finding that kids that had a father in the home completed at a higher rate than kids that did not. This was a statistically significant difference. And then not surprisingly, but concerning, obviously, is that kids that had a parent incarcerated really didn't complete at very good rates compared to those that did not have a parent that was incarcerated. So does Project Life reduce recidivism? This was our second research question. To examine this question, we looked at several outcomes to determine the factors affecting the likelihood that youth would recidivate or commit a subsequent offense following their qualifying incident. Again, we looked at charges that were filed by the prosecutor. And so across all kids assigned to Project Life, 39% recidivated or were charged with a subsequent offense, this blue part of the pie here. So the good news is almost 61% didn't recidivate. A pretty good finding to start with. But then we wanted to look at what completing Project Life did. So did they get the full dose of Project Life, and then did that help decrease their chances of recidivating? And the answer is yes. Only 35.4% of those who completed all program components of Project Life recidivated, where almost 58% who did not complete Project Life recidivated. These were statistically significant results, which tells us that completing Project Life does offer some sort of protective factor, right? So if we can get the kids to complete Project Life, then they have a better chance of not recidivating. And so it's important to remember that these are noticeable differences, that there were noticeable differences in program completion rates, right? So by gender, by whether you had your father at home, by your citizenship, there were differences in those completion rates. And so if we can figure out what it is that would help get those demographic groups that aren't completing to have higher completion rates, we would be more successful at preventing recidivism. And so finally, I want to just explain these to you so you can see what the bars mean. This is the recidivism. So if you look at these categories individually, I'm going to look at this last category, which is just a replication of the previous slide. The blue is the blue and the red match the previous slide. 35% of those who completed Project Life recidivated, did not recidivate. 35% of those who completed Project Life recidivated with any charge. 57% of those who did not recidivate, so a higher amount who didn't complete, recidivated with any charge. And the green is the entire sample. We had a recidivism rate of 39% for the entire sample. So the other example, what we're interested in over here, is the gun offense, and this is where the protective factor of completing Project Life comes into play. So the green again is the entire sample, regardless of program completion. 18.2% of the kids that recidivated with a gun offense. Of those who completed and recidivated, only 15% recidivated with a gun offense. Of those who didn't complete and recidivated, almost 1/3 had a gun offense. So you can see the protective factor. If they're going to recidivate, it's helpful that they've completed the program because they're recidivating at lower rates and they're also recidivating differently. And so these findings beg the question as to what we can do to facilitate program completion to get that protective factor. It's not going to guarantee they won't recidivate, but it definitely is going to change things. So what, you ask? I'm almost done, and then we're going to open it up for discussion. I think these two projects are a good start. A public health approach to gun violence starts with good data systems that provide consistent and comparable detailed information across sites and over time. The first project helps by creating a set definition that sites can use across jurisdictions to be able to have comparable data. And the second one provides information on youths that are involved in guns. We know from research that kids that enter the system early and young come back more often and come back more violently. So if we can stop these kids from recidivating at a younger age, that will bode well for everybody involved. I think policy-wise, a couple things come to mind. For the police, non-fatal shootings need to be treated more like we treated fatal shootings, but specifically the difference between a non-fatal shooting and a fatal shooting can be a matter of centimeters. And so it's really important to capture all the information we can on both types of shootings to inform policy and practice. For the courts, we need to be looking more closely at programming, starting with youth. This would come from the Project Life research, what works and doesn't work. So there's so little data and no evidence base for which judges can draw on, probation officers, all these folks, these actors that are involved in the court system, there's no data for them to draw on. And so we need to continue to do that. And court systems like the Marion County Superior Court need to step up and let open their doors and let researchers in to help inform them. And then finally, most people in corrections, most people that are sentenced to jail or prison return. 95% of people that go to jail or prison return to the community. And so we need to be working on this. We need to stop the revolving door. Invite my friend Beth and colleague to join us and open it up for discussion.
Well, thank you, Natalie. That was wonderful. And we already have some questions. So, and I have some as well. So that was really great. So we'll start with Jason Saltzman. And he was asking about drug-related gun violence. So, and I know I coded these. I don't really remember all of them. But when you talk about drug-related, how is that different from like me and you sharing drugs that could be interpersonal? Like, how did you separate drug-related from kind of an interpersonal?
Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah.
I think, if I recall correctly, the way we looked at that is, again, sort of in this hierarchy. And so if there was some sort of interpersonal conflict and we could see no evidence of any drugs, that you and I were just fighting over, I mean, it could be over money, it could be over gambling, it could be over, I mean, and I'm not making light of this. There's oftentimes people are fighting over really inconsequential, what seem like really unconsequential or inconsequential things, like respect, which is not inconsequential, I guess. You know what I'm saying. But they're you know, someone says your mom wears polka dotted underwear, and now I'm really upset with you, and so now we're having an interpersonal conflict. If it was coded with drugs, there had to be some sort of evidence of drugs. So either a drug sale or a drug robbery was quite common, where there was a drug deal going on and someone tried to rob the other person and then someone ended up shot. And so it's not much difference than you and I exchanging drugs and having a fight about it. But if someone didn't get shot in the middle of that, then it wouldn't have shown up in our data. So we had to have a clear indication that that there was some sort of drug relation to it. Sure. And again, with homicides, it's easier. People come forward a little bit more easily and are like, oh yeah, that's a drug house, or we know people are dealing out of that house. Where if you're shot during a drug robbery, this would be one of the ones that might show up as an unknown motive. You knew you were doing something wrong, you were breaking the law by selling drugs, and then you got shot, and so you're just not going to cooperate with the police about your case because you're worried about getting in trouble for that sort of for illegal drug dealing. Yeah. Right,
absolutely. And I know that this is why you dedicated so much time to reading all of these cases and talking to them with the police, because they're never just, it's very rarely you can put them in one bucket. There's a lot of overlap. So I appreciate all the whole hard work that goes into that. So of course, when we talk about gun laws, people talk about legislation, and I know that that's not where you do a lot of research, but apparently there was an open carry law that was signed by the governor in 2022. Yep. Yep. We do have a lot of those in Missouri too, so I understand. What are your thoughts on that? Or, have you ever been asked to share some of this research with some of the legislators or leadership in Indiana?
That's a great question. And I appreciate you asking that. And I will preface this, as Beth mentioned, that a lot of my work generally isn't around gun laws, but this open carry law piqued my interest for a lot of reasons. And so no, I haven't been asked. Every once in a while I'll get an email from a legislature, and then it just seems to never go anywhere. So I haven't really been asked a lot to talk about my work. The Project Life work is literally fresh off the presses, and you're probably the third time I've presented some of those results. And so I'm hoping that will get some traction. But the open carry law, I mean, there's two things that I sort of focused on those 16, 17, and 18-year-olds in the Project Life group. And so what I think the open carry law is going to do is sort of like what legalizing marijuana might do for some of these cases. Like, some of this is the way that police can, if they pull you over and they smell what marijuana, this is how I think a lot of these kids came into contact with the police. If they pull you over and they smell marijuana, it's illegal. And so then they can ask to search your car. And for youth especially, guns are illegal. So that's it. The case just takes from there. So there's no real sort of gray line there. But what the open carry might do is that where you have a lot of people carrying illegal weapons, but they're carrying them openly, then that doesn't give the police a chance to investigate that. And so, most of these crimes are not committed by folks that legally possess guns. And so it is a tool that law enforcement use to get people off the streets, keep crime, try and get the shooters off the street. We know shooters, once a shooter, you tend to shoot more often and you tend to get more violent. That there's evidence to support that. And you tend to carry illegally. And so I think this open carry just creates this sort of gray area where the police may not be able to know that you're carrying illegally because you're carrying open. So I just don't know what it's going to do. Again, it's not my area, and I don't want to speculate.
No. Yeah, I want to thank. I forgot to thank Margaret for that one. Also, it's difficult. I mean, what your research is doing and have that really detailed definition is because you're studying crime guns.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes people think when criminologists are studying guns that they're studying hunting guns, or you're really looking at guns that are involved in the crime. So,
right.
And hopefully the legislature will listen to some of your work, or that's sometimes hard. Okay. Another policy question. There's a lot of questions about Project Life now from Sarah. What about holding parents responsible for kids getting guns, or were parents at all involved in this sort of project?
Yes, well, actually, what's really unique about Project Life, in my opinion, is that on the third day, so it's a 3-day programming, 3 hours each day. And on the third day, there is a requirement for a guardian to attend with the child.
Mhm.
And they have some sessions together, and then they have some sessions separate from their child, from their youth, or their, whoever their person is, right? And so I think there's an attempt there. I don't know that it's holding the parent responsible, but it's an attempt to bring the parent into what's going on and the dangers of gun violence and conflict resolution and some of these other things that they're teaching the kids about. I think there's also, it's important just to talk about gun safety. Like if your kid's going to carry a gun, let's talk about gun safety. I mean, people that aren't meaning to hurt themselves shoot themselves by accident all the time. I mean, gun accidents happen all the time. And so when I talk about program completion, one of the things we'd like to look at is, does it matter which days they get? So the kids that we counted that completed Project Life had to get all 3 days. And so if you're only going to get 1 or 2 days, is it the days that you get with the parent? Is it the days that you get conflict resolution? There's a session on where the police come in and they have a positive interaction with the police officer. Is that the most important day that affects? If you can't get all 3 days, what can we do to still create that protective factor? So it would be really interesting to look at that. And I would hope that having the parent there and having this conversation between the child and their guardian and their adult in their household is really important. So yeah, they're not, in my opinion, they're not getting their guns from their parents, most of them. So it happens, but these are illegally attained guns, most of them.
Okay. Well, Rebecca wanted to follow up with that. Any more insight into kind of what happens in these 3 days?
Nope.
Okay.
So just to preface this, I received the funding for this research in late 2019 and received approval from the Indiana Supreme Court to do the work in February of 2020. Okay. And then the world shut down. And so the whole Project Life programming moved online. Part of this was doing a process evaluation and getting in and sitting through a bunch of sessions. And so I did sit on the virtual programming. Bless those people's hearts. That is a really difficult thing to do over Zoom. And so I've attended some, but no, I don't have a good answer for that. And I think that's one of the important questions that we really want to look at is these, what's important and what, I think cultural competency is really important, and they're working really hard to do that, to get people in to talk to them that look like these kids and have lived experiences like these kids. And so they're doing that on their own. These are really great people, but I do think we need to do a better process evaluation. This program's been around for almost 20 years and never been formally evaluated. So there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, well, that happens. Maybe your audience doesn't know that happens a lot. Is sometimes we have programs and we don't test them. So it's good that you're testing them. I don't know if you know how to answer this one. Jacqueline asks, how many youth actually used guns per year? So, she had 440 equals 110. So like, do you know, like, of all the people that used a gun or had a gun, and I don't know, you can't really tell how many people used a gun a year, but like, do you have a proportion or a lot of kids going through this program, or a lot of kids being punished other ways, or?
It's my understanding, and we'd like to get into, we're going to get into the two judges that approved this research have since retired. And so we're going to get into the new juvenile court judges to talk with them about this. But it's my understanding that if the kid had a gun or a gun charge, so there's that or, right, they were sentenced to this program if they were deemed safe to leave in the community. And so what that says to me is that during that time period, in theory, they got every kid that had either a gun or a gun charge that came into the system. So it doesn't mean they used the gun. So a lot of these charges, we did examine the exact charges. Again, I went a little longer than I wanted to go anyway today. And so I didn't have time to talk about all the details, but we looked at, they could be a typical situation would be that they were four kids were riding around in a car and there was a gun underneath the seat. And so all the kids were charged with possession of a weapon. None of them can have a gun. They're all underage. And so there could have been a kid in there that never touched the gun, that didn't know the gun was in there. Maybe they all did. And so I think this is part of research too, where I talked about really wanting to talk to the victims. I really want to talk to these kids that are sentenced to Project Life, and I think they'd be amenable to that just based on attending it and listening to them. I think they'd be pretty forthright. So I'd like to talk to them about it. So great question. I don't have a good answer.
Yeah, well, for people who do this research, it's children have a lot of rights. We can't just ask them all questions, so that's kind of difficult. But so you've done a great job tracking, gun crime in the Indianapolis area. Are you going to continue tracking youth gun violence as well? Like, how long is this going to continue? And this is from Margaret. Is this going to continue, or what are the plans for this long term?
So one of the other things that happens in criminal justice is that data systems change. And so the data system that I got these data out of was called the Quest system. Quest was retired in 2021 and they replaced it with a different system that is statewide. I don't know that system, in my opinion, is not as robust as the system we had. And so my funding from Joyce was for that 440. We have some things we want to continue to look at with those kids. And so just to kind of, as a teaser, out of the 440 kids that we had, 70 of them were victims of non-fatal shootings. And we know that for a fact. That's my work overlapping. And in that I've been working with IMPD for so long. I have all the lists. I have the names of all the victims. I was able to marry that with the Project Life data. And so we know that 70% of those kids have been shot as a victim. We also know that 24 of those kids are now deceased, which is a terrible statistic. So most of them by gunfire. And so I think, even though I'm not going to continue the time period, I think there's a lot of work to be done with what we have and to be able to inform policy and practice based on the data that we were able to collect for these 440 kids.
Yeah, I think that's such a critical and sad fact, is that we know that many of the people, we often think of people only as offending, but many of those same people will become victims. So
absolutely, the risk, if they're involved with guns, the risk of victimization is significantly increased. If they know someone that's been shot or they've been a shooter, the chances of them being a victim are significantly higher, and that's documented as well. Yep. Yeah, and we're seeing that in our data, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Really sad.
Yeah. And we see that across the Midwest as well.
Yes. Yeah, we're not unique. Indianapolis is not unique in this.
Right.
You're absolutely right.
And I just want to say Margaret says thank you. So thanks.
Oh, you're welcome, Margaret.
Yeah, and so we have one from our moderator and along with one from Joseph as well, is that homicides per 100,000 at the point that you presented, I know that things go up and down, are higher in Indianapolis sometimes than Chicago. I know we kind of
all the time higher than Chicago.
St. Louis is in the mix there too.
Yep.
So why is gun violence so much higher? Like, what is going on in the Midwest compared to, you put those 4 states up? What's going on?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I want to address the Chicago thing first. So Chicago has 8 million people. And so when you hear that 50 people were shot over the weekend, that's a lot of people. But if you rate that out with 8 million people, that's not as many as it sounds like. And so Indianapolis and the 4 sites that I put up there are consistently higher than Chicago when you rate it out per 100,000 people. The national average, like I said, is like 5 per 100,000 people. And so I think Detroit and St. Louis are usually up in the top 5. Milwaukee and Indianapolis are usually up in the top 15, maybe 10 to 15 consistently year over year. We don't have a ranking from 2021 because of the switchover from UCR. Indiana isn't included in the flip over from UCR to NIBRS. But that's a great question about why the Midwest was bucking the trend. And we don't, all of us, you were part of this project, Beth, we don't really know. It's just sort of an interesting thing. I don't have a good answer for you. It doesn't look like because what's interesting is you're seeing the same patterns in the 4 cities. And so, it's not like Indianapolis is doing something different than Milwaukee and St. Louis and Detroit. And so why our trends and Kansas City's high, like that, we would lump them into the Midwest as well. Kansas City, Missouri, they're all high. And it could be something to look at with, again, gun laws or access or permitting or all these other things. But again, I think the gun violence is being committed by crime guns, which are illegal guns, not generally by people that legally buy and possess guns. Right. So I don't have a good answer.
Yeah, no, great question, Joseph. I was just going to say too, with these rates are so difficult. There's lots of stuff been published on that. It's just, there's so many, like you said, so many more people in Chicago. We have a moment. I want to talk about the economy as well. That might be a factor as well. And that's where we see some really challenges in the Midwest, but we have more questions. So this is a great question from Rebecca. It sounds like law enforcement has been willing to cooperate and with their research, which for those of you who are listening, this is kind of rare. This doesn't always happen. What has been law enforcement's response and attitude towards your findings?
Thank you for asking that. And again, I want to give a shout out to the Indianapolis Police Department. They have been their biggest desire is to be transparent with this and to collect accurate numbers. And it has been not an easy process. It is police data systems are not meant for research. They're meant for reporting and for crime and for case investigations. And so it's been a really difficult process. And as Beth said, it's really, to have a longstanding relationship with a researcher is rare. And I think, interestingly, they want more. They ask these same questions that you're asking. What else can you tell us? Why do you think there are more females? And so then, my work as a researcher is to take sort of a different angle than they're used to looking at. So can I dig deeper into the case narratives to look at why females are becoming victims at a higher rate, or exactly how these kids are coming into contact with the police? And so the truth is, I believe every police department should have a researcher on staff. And so most don't, it's a rare thing. And so some of this is just sort of a balance of if I have grant money to support research, what can they do? What can I train them or train their analysts to do internally that they can do themselves? And so sadly, it results in me having to say no sometimes because I have a job at IU that I have to attend to as well. And so they just want more. They are desperate to bring these numbers down, just like everyone. And the officers, they don't want to see another shooting victim. Like this is stuff they don't want to see, and it keeps happening, and they don't understand why. And so, the work, if I can do work to help them solve this why, and some of it may or may not be them. And so, yeah, so it's a great question. And there's many police departments out there that work with researchers, but I think IMPD is one of the best out there.
Yeah,
I'm biased.
yeah. Well, kudos to them. Also, I just want to say kudos to you, because I know that you also, since it's IU Day, you also bring a lot of students along on this too, right? So they continue. Some of them may, in fact, I don't know if you have any students that work as part of crime analysts or go on.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot, when you're training PhD students, you tend to think about training them to go into academia and to be professors and to teach and things like that. But I think there's a lot with the new generation of students that are coming in. A lot of them want to go back out into the community and do applied work. And that means working with police departments, working with hospitals, working with law enforcement agencies, prosecutors' offices, probation and parole, and bringing their data set and the same sort of skills that I'm talking about in-house to these places. And I think I think it's finally, it's not a new thing, but I think people are really valuing data-informed policy, right? Like we can't just pick a policy out of the sky and just hope that it works. We should be looking at the things that work and the reasons why they work and build policy and practice around that.
Great. Well, we have a couple more questions to keep them coming in. So Joseph has a question in terms of, you talked a little bit about race in homicides. Could you just kind of reiterate that he asked Black on Black violence higher than Black on white? What is kind of the victim and the offender dyad? What's the
dyad
there?
Yeah. You know what? I didn't really look at that. To be honest, I feel that has been looked at a lot over time, and it just wasn't really something that stuck out in our work. What I can talk about related to race is cooperativeness, and we looked at this across the 4 cities as well in our project. Victim cooperativeness, so we're talking about the folks that survived. We looked at wound severity, so where they were shot on their body and whether or not they were cooperative with the police. And we have found that the more serious the injury, the more likely a white person is to cooperate with the police. So if they're shot in their chest or their stomach, like a center mass sort of shot, the more serious the wound is, the more likely they're to cooperate with the police. On the toss side of that, we found that people of color are just more unwilling to cooperate with the police, regardless of where they're shot on their body, regardless of where the severity is. And so that's an interesting finding, in that it doesn't matter that maybe they almost died from their gunshot wound. Something's going on that they're unwilling to cooperate with their case. And so is that they are skeptical of law enforcement? Are they worried about retaliation? Were they committing a crime while they were victimized? And we don't know. And so that was one of the interesting race findings we were able to look at. And there's a larger sort of discussion going on there with procedural justice, with police community relations, especially post George Floyd and all these other incidents. And so this trust issue, I mentioned it, a little bit in there. It's really important when you're trying to get accurate information about these incidents that requires the police to be involved. And so if people don't trust the police, then the police rarely solve cases on their own. And I'm not insulting the police department when I say that. They need input from the community, from witnesses, from victims, from everyone. And so if there is some sort of barrier there between this relationship, that's what the police need to be working on, is how to fix that so they can get at the root, right? And get the folks that are doing the shooting off the streets. So yeah, I didn't really look at the dyads much, I'm sorry.
Yeah. But obviously there is some research out there. So something like that. So we have time for one more question. So Sarah is going to get right under the line here. I know that you work with the police department all the time now, as you mentioned. So I don't, not necessarily part of your research here, but do you know, are there just more guns, legal and illegal, in circulation now? Is that anything that the police talk about, or maybe ATF? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good question. And part of the problem is you're talking about illegal guns. And so trying to get a count on stuff that's illegal is really difficult, right? It's hard to count what you can't see. And so the other issue is the ATF is, and so I will say every gun that's confiscated during a crime, IMPD runs it through the ATF. Like there's a whole thing they do with that to kind of take, each gun has its own fingerprint. It goes into a place called NIBIN, the National Ballistic, I can't remember what the acronym is right now, but anyway, it goes into NIBIN. And so then if someone gets shot by a bullet from the gun later, they can match it. So it's like its own sort of fingerprint system for guns, but they're not allowed to share that data. With researchers, it's law enforcement only. ATF is law enforcement only. It's been that way for many, many years. I think that's one of the things the government needs to work on, is opening up access to the purchasing data, the licensing data, all the data out there that is heavily influenced by lobbyists in Washington, D.C. And I'll just sort of leave it at that. And so we don't have a good grip on that. And I think that's something within IMPD, if they had an analyst within their ranks, somebody could spend a lot of time just looking at that.
Sure.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. So many things to count. Well, this has just been awesome, and thank you so much. And I think then we'll have it all wrapped up.
Great. Thank you so much again for joining us and participating in this evening's live stream. I would like to thank Professors Hipple and Huebner for their time and expertise. We are grateful to you all. Additionally, I would like to take the opportunity to thank the IU Alumni Association and its members for assisting with tonight's program. Finally, I should acknowledge that events like this would not be possible without the support of donors who understand the value of a liberal arts education. If you would like to support the faculty, students, and programs of the College of Arts and Sciences, please consider making a contribution to the Arts and Sciences Priority Fund at the Indiana University Foundation. Until next time, please take care and stay safe.